The air over Terra Prime hung heavy with ash, a suffocating shroud that blotted out the sun and turned the skies a sickly shade of gray. The once vibrant oceans, teeming with life, now hissed and bubbled with acid, their surfaces reflecting the eerie glow of a dying world. The land was a graveyard of twisted metal and shattered stone, where towering skyscrapers had collapsed into jagged ruins, and the remnants of humanity's greatest cities lay buried beneath layers of soot and silence. Nothing moved. Nothing lived. The planet, once a cradle of life, had become a tomb. Admiral Cale Draven's voice broke through this desolation, low and steady, yet carrying the weight of unmeasured grief. "They thought they could silence us," he began, his words laced with a quiet fury. "They thought Terra Prime would be our grave. But they underestimated what desperation can forge." Cale's words seemed to echo across the ruins, as if the planet itself still remembered the horrors that had unfolded. In his mind, the memories played out like a nightmare he could never escape. The attack had come without warning, an unrelenting assault by the Zereth Dominion, their massive warships descending from the void like vultures circling a dying beast. The first orbital bombardments turned entire continents into fields of molten glass. Cities were erased in moments, their inhabitants reduced to shadows etched into the walls of what remained. The Zereth spared no one. Their fleets unleashed waves of plasma fire that carved through the planet's defenses, leaving nothing but smoldering craters where humanity's proudest achievements had once stood. Cale had been there, a young officer stationed in one of Terra Prime's last bastions of resistance. He remembered the deafening roar of explosions, the ground trembling beneath his feet as the Zereth's weapons tore through the city. He remembered the screams, so many screams cut short as buildings collapsed and fire consumed everything. And he remembered his family. They had been caught in the chaos, trapped beneath the rubble of their home as Cale fought to reach them. He could still see their faces, could still hear his son's voice calling out to him, faint and desperate. But the Zereth's onslaught was merciless, and Cale had been forced to retreat, dragged away by his comrades as the ground beneath his family gave way. He had watched, helpless, as the flames swallowed them whole. The memory burned in his mind, sharper than any blade. It was a wound that would never heal, a pain that fueled the fire in his soul. The scene shifted to Fort Solaris, humanity's last refuge, a colossal orbital station that floated above the ruins of Terra Prime like a silent sentinel. Its design was both utilitarian and imposing, with massive steel spires and reinforced hulls bristling with weaponry. Inside, the remnants of humanity clung to survival, their numbers a fraction of what they once were. Cale, now Admiral of the ISS Nemesis, stood before his crew in the command chamber of the station. The room was stark and cold, its walls lined with holographic displays showing the devastation below. The faces of his crew were grim, their eyes hollowed by loss but burning with a quiet determination. They were survivors, each carrying their own scars, their own stories of what they had lost. Cale's voice cut through the silence, sharp and unyielding. "Terra Prime is gone," he said, his tone as cold as the void. But humanity is not. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle over the room. "We will make them remember us not as victims, but as the storm they should have feared." The crew straightened, their resolve hardening at his words. They knew what he meant. This was no longer about survival. This was about vengeance. The ISS Nemesis, humanity's most advanced warship, was their weapon, their answer to the Zereth's cruelty. And Cale Draven, forged in the fires of loss and rage, would lead them into the darkness. As Cale turned to the massive viewport overlooking the station, his gaze fell on the broken planet below. Terra Prime, his home, was gone. But in its ashes, something stronger had been born. something the Zereth could never have anticipated. Desperation had forged humanity into a blade, and now that blade was pointed at the heart of their enemy. The ISS Nemesis loomed in the void like a shadow carved from the darkness itself. Its hull, a seamless expanse of black metal, seemed to devour the faint light of distant stars, leaving it as an ominous silhouette against the endless abyss. The ship's angular design was sharp and predatory, its edges cutting through the emptiness like a blade forged for vengeance. It was massive, yet silent, its presence more like a lurking predator than a mere vessel. The engines, buried deep within the ship's core, emitted a low, otherworldly hum that reverberated through the surrounding space. The sound was unnatural, almost alive, as if the ship itself were breathing. This was no ordinary warship. Every inch of the Nemesis spoke of desperation and brilliance, of humanity's refusal to die quietly. The ship's origins were a whispered secret among the crew. Its construction had been a monumental effort, born from the ruins of Terra Prime and the scavenged remnants of alien technology. Deep beneath the surface of their dying world, humanity had unearthed ruins older than their history, remnants of a civilization long vanished. The Nemesis was the result of their gamble-a fusion of human ingenuity and forbidden knowledge. Its systems defied conventional science, powered by energies that no one fully understood. But understanding was a luxury humanity could no longer afford. Inside, the ship was a stark contrast to its ominous exterior. The walls of the bridge were lined with sleek, dark panels that pulsed faintly with light, like veins carrying energy through a living organism. The air was heavy with tension, the kind born from shared loss and unspoken determination. Admiral Cale Draven stood at the center of the bridge, his figure silhouetted against the massive viewport that stretched across the front of the room. Beyond the glass, the void stretched endlessly, a cold and uncaring expanse. Yet the Nemesis seemed to challenge that void, its presence defiant, unyielding. Cale's expression was carved from stone, his eyes like twin embers burning with purpose. He turned to face his crew, the men and women who had survived Terra Prime's fall and now stood ready to follow him into the heart of their enemy. Each face was marked by loss, eyes hardened by grief, jaws set with quiet rage. They were not soldiers anymore. They were survivors, each one carrying the weight of a world that no longer existed. Cale's voice cut through the silence, steady and commanding. "This ship is not just a weapon," he began, his tone low but filled with an unshakable resolve. It's a promise. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. A promise that we will never kneel again. The crews straightened, their expressions shifting from grim determination to something fiercer hope, tempered by rage. They had lost everything, but they still had this. They still had the Nemesis. Cale turned back to the viewport, his gaze fixed on the distant stars. Somewhere out there lay the Zereth Dominion, the architects of humanity's destruction. Their fleets had reduced Terra Prime to ash, their weapons had slaughtered billions, and their arrogance had left them blind to the storm now bearing down on them. The Nemesis began to stir, its engines flaring to life with a sound that was almost a growl. The ship seemed to shudder, as if eager to be unleashed. The hum of its core grew louder, a deep, resonant pulse that filled the bridge and seemed to vibrate in the bones of everyone aboard. Cale's voice, calm and resolute, echoed through the ship's comms. Prepare for the jump. The crew moved with practiced efficiency, their hands flying over consoles, their voices low and steady as they relayed commands. They were ready. They had to be. The Nemesis began to glow faintly, its hull shimmering as the energy coursing through its systems reached a crescendo. The stars outside the viewport seemed to blur and stretch, as if the ship were bending the fabric of reality itself. And then, with a soundless burst, the Nemesis vanished, leaving behind only a ripple in the void. As the ship hurtled through hyperspace, the crews sat in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Some clutched small tokens, photographs, trinkets, reminders of the lives they had lost. Others stared straight ahead, their faces grim, their minds focused on the battle to come. Kale remained at the viewport, his hands clasped behind his back. His thoughts were a storm of memories and resolve. He could still see the faces of his family, still hear their voices calling out to him in those final moments. He had failed them once. He would not fail again. The Nemesis was more than a ship. It was humanity's last hope, their final stand against the darkness. And as it raced toward the Zereth Dominion's core systems, it carried with it the weight of a species that refused to die. Kale's voice, quiet but unyielding, broke the silence once more. Asterisk, they thought they could break us. Let's show them what's left. Asterisk. The crew nodded, their resolve unshaken. The Nemesis pressed onward, a shadow in the void, carrying with it the promise of retribution. The Zereth home system unfolded before the Nemesis like a forbidden realm, its twin suns casting an eerie, golden light across a sprawling armada of alien warships. The Zereth fleet filled the void, their vessels vast and angular, glowing faintly with the energy of ancient, unknowable technology. Their formations were precise, almost predatory, stretching out like a net designed to ensnare anything foolish enough to challenge them. The air aboard the Nemesis felt heavier, as if the crew could feel the oppressive presence of the enemy even from light years away. Admiral Kale Draven stood at the helm, his gaze fixed on the endless sea of Zereth ships. His face was unreadable, carved from stone, but his eyes burned with a quiet, unrelenting rage. Around him, the crew worked in tense silence, their movements sharp and deliberate. They knew what was coming. They had prepared for this moment since the day Terra Prime fell. The Nemesis drifted forward, a lone shadow against the overwhelming brilliance of the Zereth fleet. Its black hull seemed to drink in the light of the twin suns, making it appear as though the ship were a fragment of the void itself, moving with purpose. It was a single spark of defiance in the face of an inferno. The Zereth armada began to shift, their ships adjusting their positions with unnerving precision. The enemy was ready. They were waiting. But so was the Nemesis. Kale's voice, calm and steady, broke the silence on the bridge. Asterisk, all stations, prepare for engagement. Today, we remind them who we are. Asterisk. The first strike came from the Nemesis. A blinding lance of plasma tore through the darkness, its searing light cutting a path straight into the heart of the Zereth formation. The beam struck one of their cruisers, and for a moment, the ship glowed like a dying star before disintegrating into a cloud of molten debris. The battle had begun. The Zereth fleet responded instantly. Waves of energy weapons and missiles surged toward the Nemesis, their combined firepower enough to annihilate a lesser vessel. But the Nemesis was no ordinary ship. Its advanced shielding absorbed the attacks like ripples against a stone, and its countermeasures sprang to life. Swarms of autonomous attack drones erupted from its hull, darting through the chaos like metallic hornets, tearing through the Zereth ships with surgical precision. The Nemesis pressed forward, its arsenal unleashed in a symphony of destruction. Railguns fired projectiles at near-light speeds, punching through Zereth hulls as if they were paper. Plasma lances carved through entire squadrons, their fiery trails leaving nothing but wreckage in their wake. The Zereth ships began to falter, their once imposing formation breaking apart under the relentless assault. But the battle was far from over. From the heart of the Zereth fleet, their flagship emerged, a colossal dreadnought that dwarfed even the largest of its companions. Its hull was a fortress of molten black metal, pulsating with veins of crimson energy. It moved with a deliberate, almost arrogant grace, as though it knew it was the apex predator in this fight. The dreadnought unleashed its fury. Massive beams of energy erupted from its cannons, each one capable of destroying a city in a single strike. The Nemesis evaded with precision, its movements almost ghost-like as it slipped through the barge. But the dreadnought was relentless, its weapons carving through the void in pursuit of the human ship. Kale's voice rang out again, colder this time. Bring the Voidbreaker cannon online. The crew hesitated for only a moment before obeying. Deep within the Nemesis, the Voidbreaker cannon began to awaken. The air on the bridge seemed to grow colder, and the faint hum of the ship's engines was replaced by a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to come from the very fabric of reality. The weapon was humanity's greatest and most terrible creation, a device capable of erasing matter at the atomic level. It was a power they barely understood, and one they used only when there was no other choice. The dreadnought loomed closer, its weapons charging for another strike. But before it could fire, the Voidbreaker cannon unleashed its wrath. There was no sound, no explosion, only a flash of light so bright it seemed to burn through the darkness of space itself. For a moment, the dreadnought was illuminated, its massive form outlined in stark relief against the void. And then it was gone, erased so completely that not even debris remained. The silence that followed was deafening. The Zereth fleet hesitated, their movements faltering as they processed what had just happened. Their flagship, their symbol of power, had been destroyed in an instant. And the Nemesis was still there, untouched, its black hull gleaming like a harbinger of doom. A hologram flickered to life on the bridge, and the image of the Zereth commander appeared. The alien was a towering, skeletal figure, its body encased in molten armor that pulsed with a sinister red glow. Its eyes burned with hatred as it snarled, its voice a guttural hiss. Human, you are outnumbered. Surrender, and we may spare your colonies. Kale stepped forward, his expression unchanging. His voice was low, but every word carried the weight of all humanity's suffering. You spared no one on Terra Prime. He paused, his gaze locking with the aliens. We will return the favor. The Zereth commander's image flickered and vanished, and the Nemesis surged forward. The battle became a massacre. The Nemesis tore through the Zereth fleet with unrelenting fury, its weapons reducing their ships to fields of silent wreckage. One by one, the Zereth vessels fell, their once mighty armada shattered and broken. When the battle finally ended, the void was littered with the remains of the Zereth fleet. The Nemesis drifted through the silence, its black hull untouched, its engines humming softly. On the bridge, the crews sat in stunned silence, the weight of what they had done settling over them. Kale stood alone at the viewport, his gaze fixed on the wreckage. He felt no joy, no triumph, only a cold, hollow ache. The Zereth had taken everything from him, from all of them. And now, he had taken everything from them. The Nemesis turned away from the ruins of the Zereth fleet, its engines flaring to life. There were still battles to be fought, still vengeance to be claimed. Terra Prime was gone, but humanity's fire burned brighter than ever. And the Nemesis would carry that fire into the darkness, until there was nothing left to burn. The Nemesis hung in the void, its engines humming with quiet power as the crew braced for their next mission. The air on the bridge was tense but focused, every officer at their station, every movement purposeful. But then, the silence was broken by a sudden, piercing chime. An urgent signal flashed across the ship's systems, its origin tagged with a name that sent a chill through every soul aboard, Terra Prime. Admiral Kale Draven's head snapped toward the comms officer, his voice sharp. What is it? The officer hesitated, their face pale. It's seismic activity, sir. Something's happening on Terra Prime. Asterisk. Kale's heart clenched at the words. Terra Prime, humanity's cradle, now a graveyard of ash and ruin. What could possibly remain? The bridge's main display flickered to life, showing the incoming data. The readings were chaotic, almost incomprehensible. Massive tremors were tearing through the planet's crust, and from beneath the scorched earth, something was emerging. A structure, impossibly large, was rising from the depths, a black spire, its surface smooth and alien, as if it had been carved from the void itself. It climbed higher and higher, piercing the sky like a dagger aimed at the heavens. Dr. Ilra Voss, the Nemesis's lead scientist, stood at her station, her face illuminated by the cold blue glow of her console. Her fingers flew across the controls, pulling up every piece of data she could find. The more she read, the deeper the lines of worry etched into her face. "Admiral," she said, her voice steady but laced with unease. Asterisk, this spire, it predates human civilization by millions of years. Its material composition doesn't match anything we've ever encountered. And the energy readings, asterisk, she paused, her eyes narrowing as she stared at the screen. Asterisk, whatever this is, it's not natural. Asterisk. Kale's gaze hardened. Asterisk, what about the signal? The disruption? Asterisk. Ilra nodded grimly. Asterisk, the spire is emitting a low-frequency hum. It's interfering with communications across the entire system. And, asterisk, she hesitated, her voice dropping to a whisper. Asterisk, it's growing stronger. Asterisk. The bridge fell silent, the weight of her words pressing down on everyone. Kale straightened, his jaw set. Asterisk, prepare the Nemesis. We're going back to Terra Prime. Asterisk. Dash. The journey back to humanity's ruined homeworld was tense, the crew's minds racing with questions they dared not voice. What was this spire? Why now? And what did it mean for the remnants of their species? As the Nemesis approached the planet, the familiar sight of Terra Prime's shattered surface came into view. The once vibrant world was now a wasteland of ash and desolation, its atmosphere choked with the lingering scars of war. But amidst the ruins, something new had risen. The spire towered above the broken land, a monolith of impossible proportions. Its surface was sleek and black, like polished obsidian, but it seemed to ripple faintly, as though it were alive. Strange symbols, glowing with an eerie, otherworldly light, pulsed across its surface in rhythmic patterns. The light shifted between colors, deep crimson, ghostly blue, and a pale, sickly green, each pulse casting an unnatural glow over the ruins below. The Nemesis descended into the planet's atmosphere, its hull trembling slightly as the low-frequency hum from the spire grew louder. The sound wasn't just heard, it was felt. It resonated in the bones, a deep, unsettling vibration that seemed to echo in the very core of one's being. The crew exchanged uneasy glances, their hands gripping their stations a little tighter. Kale stood at the viewport, his face a mask of stoic determination. But even he couldn't ignore the sense of dread that coiled in his chest as the spire came into full view. It was ancient, alien, and utterly unknowable. And yet, it felt purposeful. As though it had been waiting for this moment, for their return. Asterisk, what the hell is it? Asterisk, one of the officers murmured, their voice barely audible. Ilra stepped forward, her eyes fixed on the spire. It's a signal, she said softly. Asterisk, a beacon. But for what? I don't know. Asterisk. The Nemesis landed on the outskirts of the spire, its engines hissing as they powered down. A small team, led by Kale and Ilra, prepared to disembark. The air outside was thick and heavy, charged with an energy that made every breath feel like a struggle. The hum of the spire was louder now, almost deafening, and the ground beneath their feet seemed to vibrate in time with it. As they approached the base of the spire, its sheer size became even more overwhelming. It stretched into the sky, its tip disappearing into the perpetual gray haze that hung over the planet. The symbols on its surface pulsed faster, their light casting strange, shifting shadows across the ground. The air around the spire felt alive, crackling with unseen forces that made the hair on the back of Kale's neck stand on end. Illyria knelt beside a fragment of the spire's base, her scanner trembling in her hands as she tried to make sense of the readings. Her voice was barely a whisper. This thing, it's older than anything we've ever found. It's drawing energy from the planet itself, from the core. And it's, she hesitated, her eyes widening. It's waking up. Kale's gaze snapped to her. Waking up. Before she could answer, the ground beneath them shuddered violently. A deep, resonant sound like the groan of a dying world echoed across the ruins. The symbols on the spire flared brighter, their colors shifting faster, more erratically. The hum grew louder, a deafening roar that seemed to pierce through their very minds. Kale's voice cut through the chaos, sharp and commanding. Back to the ship. Now. The team scrambled to retreat, their movements frantic as the spire's light intensified. As they ran, Kale cast one last glance over his shoulder. The spire seemed to pulse with life, its surface shifting and writhing as though it were alive. And in that moment, he felt a presence, vast and ancient, watching them from somewhere beyond the veil of reality. The Nemesis lifted off, its engines roaring as it ascended into the sky. From the safety of the ship, the crew watched as the spire continued to pulse, its light reaching out into the void like a beacon. Whatever it was, whatever it meant, one thing was certain. The spire had risen. And it was only the beginning. The team descended from the Nemesis, their breaths shallow as they approached the towering spire. Its sheer presence was overwhelming, a monolith of ancient power that seemed to defy reality itself. The air around it was heavy, thick with an unseen force that pressed against their bodies and minds. Each step closer felt like moving through a dream that teetered on the edge of nightmare. Kale led the way, his jaw clenched, his every instinct screaming at him to turn back. But he couldn't. Whatever this spire was, it held answers humanity desperately needed. Behind him, Dr. Illyria Voss and the rest of the team followed, their faces pale but resolute. The hum of the spire grew louder with every step, a deep, resonant vibration that seemed to crawl into their skulls and settle there, pulsing in time with their racing hearts. As they drew nearer, the world around them began to shift. Gravity twisted unpredictably, pulling them forward one moment and dragging them back the next. The ground beneath their feet rippled like water, yet remained solid. Time itself seemed to falter. Kale would glance at Illyria, only to see her movements stutter and blur, as though she were caught between seconds. The spire wasn't just a structure, it was a wound in reality, bleeding its influence into the world. "Stay close," Kale ordered, his voice steady despite the chaos around them. The team nodded, their eyes darting nervously as the spire loomed ever larger, its surface alive with shifting symbols and eerie light. The hum had become a roar now, a sound that wasn't just heard but felt, vibrating in their bones and echoing in their minds. Finally, they reached the base of the spire. A narrow opening yawned before them, its edges glowing faintly with an unnatural light. The air inside was colder, sharper, carrying with it a sense of vastness that didn't belong in the confines of the structure. Kale hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside, his hand tightening around the weapon at his side. The others followed, their footsteps echoing unnaturally in the strange, hollow space. Dash. The interior of the spire was unlike anything they had ever seen. The walls were smooth and black, but they seemed to shimmer and shift, as though they were not entirely solid. Strange glyphs pulsed faintly along the surfaces, their light casting shifting shadows that danced like living things. The air was thick with energy, crackling faintly, and the hum of the spire was now a constant presence, a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to vibrate in their very souls. As they moved deeper into the spire, the sense of wrongness grew. The laws of reality no longer seemed to hold sway here. Objects floated weightlessly in the air, shimmering with faint light. Time continued to stutter and Warp Kale would glance at his team, only to see them frozen mid-step, their forms flickering like images on a broken screen. And yet, they pressed on, drawn by a force they could not name. At last, they entered a vast chamber at the heart of the spire. The room was immense, its walls curving upward into darkness. The air was alive with swirling energy streams of light and shadow that twisted and danced like living things. Shards of glowing material floated in the air, spinning slowly, their edges sharp and jagged. The light they emitted was cold, almost painful to look at, and it cast strange, angular patterns across the chamber. At the center of the room, suspended in the swirling chaos, was the Prime Echo. It was a sphere of dark energy, its surface rippling and pulsating like a living thing. Tendrils of shadow extended from it, curling and twisting through the air like smoke. But within the darkness, there was light faint, flickering, and impossibly ancient. The Prime Echo seemed to breathe, its form expanding and contracting in a slow, rhythmic pulse. It radiated a presence that was both terrifying and mesmerizing, a power so vast and alien that it defied comprehension. Kale felt it before he heard it, a voice, deep and resonant, speaking directly into his mind. It was not a voice made of words but of thoughts, emotions, and memories, all woven together into something that was almost impossible to grasp. * We are what you buried to survive. Now, we awaken. * Kale staggered, clutching his head as the voice filled his mind. It was not just speaking to him, it was showing him. Visions flooded his thoughts, overwhelming and vivid. He saw humanity's distant past, a time so ancient it felt like a dream. They were not the fragile, mortal beings they were now. They were God's beings of light and power, capable of reshaping reality with a thought. But their power had come at a cost. The Prime Echo had been their creation, their shadow. It had grown, fed by their ambitions, until it became something they could no longer control. In their desperation, humanity had made a choice. They had cast off their godhood, choosing mortality to escape the Prime Echo's influence. They had buried it, hidden it away, and forgotten it. But now, it had returned. Reclaim what you were, or be forgotten. The voice was calm but unyielding, its words carrying the weight of inevitability. Kale felt his knees weaken under the pressure of its presence. He saw flashes of the future humanity's struggle against Azirath, their dwindling numbers, their fragile hope. He saw the Nemesis, a lone spark against the darkness. And he saw the Prime Echo, vast and infinite, offering them the power they had once abandoned. Admiral. Ilara's voice cut through the haze, grounding him. He turned to see her staring at him, her face pale but determined. What's happening? What do we do? Kale's mind raced. The choice was clear, but the weight of it was crushing. To reclaim what they had been was to embrace a power they could barely comprehend. But to refuse was to fade into obscurity, to let humanity's light be snuffed out forever. He closed his eyes, his thoughts a storm of doubt and fear. But then he saw them, his people, the survivors of Terra Prime, the crew of the Nemesis. He saw their faces, their hope, their determination. And he knew. Kale opened his eyes, his voice steady. Asterisk, we accept. Asterisk. The prime echo pulsed, its light flaring brighter. The tendrils of shadow reached out, wrapping around Kale and his team. The chamber dissolved into light and darkness, and for a moment, there was nothing but the hum of the spire, deep and eternal. And then, everything changed. The Nemesis hovered in orbit above Terra Prime, its once familiar silhouette now unrecognizable against the void. The ship, once a marvel of human engineering, was no longer merely a vessel of metal and machinery. It had become something else, something alive. The transformation had begun the moment the Prime Echo merged with its core, and now the Nemesis pulsed with an otherworldly energy, its form shimmering like liquid starlight. The hull, once cold and unyielding, now seemed to breathe. Its surface was smooth and organic, shifting subtly as if alive, faint patterns of glowing light coursing across it like veins. The ship no longer reflected the harsh light of distant stars. Instead, it seemed to absorb it, radiating a soft, ethereal glow that cast an eerie halo around its massive frame. The once angular edges of its structure had softened, flowing into shapes that were both beautiful and alien. It no longer looked like a weapon of war, it looked like a creature born of the cosmos, ancient and unknowable. Inside, the transformation was even more profound. The corridors of the Nemesis, once sterile and metallic, now pulsed with faint luminescence. The walls seemed to hum faintly, resonating with the same energy that coursed through the ship's core. Strange, organic patterns had begun to form along the surfaces, their shapes shifting and flowing like living murals. The air itself felt different, thicker, charged with a presence that was both comforting and overwhelming. The crew could feel it. The change wasn't just in the ship, it was in them. At first, it was subtle, a faint tingling at the edges of their minds, a sense of connection they couldn't quite explain. But as the minutes passed, the changes became impossible to ignore. Their senses sharpened. They could hear the faintest whispers of movement, see details in the dimmest of light. Colors seemed brighter, sounds clearer. And then came the voices not spoken, but felt. Thoughts, emotions, impressions, all flowing between them like a river of shared consciousness. Kale stood on the bridge, his presence commanding yet serene. He was no longer the man he had been. His eyes, once sharp and calculating, now glowed with an inner light, their depths shimmering like the heart of a star. His very being radiated power, but it was not the cold, hard power of authority, it was something deeper, something ancient. The Prime Echo had touched him, and he had become its vessel. The crew gathered around him, their faces a mixture of awe and trepidation. They could feel him in their minds, not as an invader, but as a guide, a beacon in a storm of change. When he spoke, his voice was calm but resonant, carrying a weight that seemed to vibrate through the very air. "We are no longer what we were," he said, his words ringing with quiet conviction. Asterisk, the limits of flesh, of thought, of fear, they no longer bind us. We are more now. We are the storm they cannot escape. Asterisk. The crew didn't respond with words, they didn't need to. Their thoughts flowed into his, a silent chorus of understanding and resolve. They had been given a gift, a power they could barely comprehend, and they would use it. Not for conquest, not for vengeance, but for survival, for humanity. The Nemesis itself seemed to respond to Kale's words. The ship's core pulsed with light, sending waves of energy rippling through its hull. The weapons systems, once clunky arrays of cannons and missiles, had transformed into sleek, organic structures that radiated a quiet menace. They no longer fired projectiles, they unleashed pure energy, a force that could tear through the fabric of space itself. The engines roared with newfound power. There sounded a deep, resonant thrum that seemed to shake the stars. Kale turned to the navigation officer, who now sat at their station with eyes closed, their hands resting lightly on the console. They didn't need to touch it. The ship responded to their thoughts, its systems an extension of their mind. Set course for the Zerith capital, Kale said, his voice steady. The officer nodded, their thoughts aligning with the ship's will. The Nemesis shuddered slightly, its engines flaring with light as it prepared to move. As the ship began its journey, the crews settled into their new roles. They no longer needed words to communicate. Thoughts and emotions flowed freely between them, creating a unity they had never known. They were no longer individuals bound by the fragility of flesh and bone. They were part of something greater, something that transcended the limits of humanity. In the silence of the bridge, Kale stood at the viewport, his glowing eyes fixed on the distant stars. He could feel the prime echo within him, its presence vast and ancient, but not oppressive. It was a guide, a reminder of what they had been and what they could become. And as the Nemesis hurtled toward its destiny, Kale felt a quiet certainty settle over him. They were no longer prey, no longer a species on the brink of extinction. They were the storm, the force that would reshape the galaxy. And nothing, no Zerith fleet, no ancient enemy could stand in their way. The Nemesis hung in the black void above the Zerith home world, a shimmering specter of vengeance. The planet below was a sprawling mosaic of cities and fortresses, its surface scarred by centuries of conquest and domination. The Zerith had ruled with iron and fire, bending countless civilizations to their will. But now, their reign was ending not with defiance, but with silence. They could feel the Nemesis above them, its presence pressing down on their world like the weight of an unspoken judgment. Kale stood at the helm, his glowing eyes fixed on the planet below. The Nemesis pulsed around him, alive with energy and purpose. He could feel it in his mind, a symphony of thoughts and power, the ship and crew united in a single, unstoppable force. The Zerith forces had gathered what remained of their fleets, a desperate attempt to defend their home. But Kale knew it was futile. The Nemesis was no longer just a warship, it was the embodiment of humanity's fury, a storm that could not be resisted. Begin, Kale said softly, his voice carrying the weight of inevitability. The Nemesis responded instantly. Its weapons systems, now evolved into incomprehensible forms of energy manipulation, flared to life. Beams of pure light tore through the void, slicing through Zerith ships as though they were paper. Explosions blossomed in the darkness, brief flashes of color before fading into silence. The Zerith fleet crumbled in moments, their ships unable to withstand the Nemesis's power. On the planet's surface, defenses activated, sending streams of missiles and energy blasts skyward. But the Nemesis absorbed them effortlessly, its shimmering hull rippling with faint light as it consumed the attacks. Kale's voice echoed across the Zerith communication channels, calm but unyielding. Asterisk, you sought to erase us. Now, we erase you. Asterisk. The Nemesis descended closer, its presence growing heavier, darker. The skies above the Zerith home world turned black, the light of their sun dimming as the ship unleashed its final strike. Streams of energy poured down like rivers of fire, consuming entire cities in seconds. The ground quaked, splitting apart as the Nemesis's wrath reshaped the planet itself. The Zerith leaders watched in horror, their faces pale as they realized the truth: they were not fighting an enemy. They were facing judgment. When it was over, the Zerith home world was silent. The once great empire had been reduced to ashes, its legacy wiped clean from the stars. The Nemesis hung above the ruins, glowing faintly, its presence a warning to all who dared defy humanity. Across the galaxy, whispers spread like wildfire. The other alien empires, once allies or rivals of the Zerith, surrendered without a fight. They sent messages of peace, pledges of loyalty, anything to avoid the wrath of the Nemesis. But the whispers carried something darker. Fear turned to doubt, and doubt turned to dread. Had humanity become something even more dangerous than a Zereth Dominion? The Nemesis, with its living hull and telepathic crew, was no longer just a ship, it was a force beyond comprehension. And Kale, glowing with the light of the Prime Echo, was no longer just a man. He was something more. Something terrifying. The Nemesis drifted in the quiet of space, its transformation complete, its crew united in purpose. But the silence was broken by a faint, desperate signal. It came from the edge of the galaxy, a place where no light could reach, where the stars themselves seemed to fade into nothingness. The message was brief, fragmented, but its meaning was clear. A new threat had emerged. The Eclipse Core. Kale stood on the bridge, his glowing eyes fixed on the distant stars. The distress signal played faintly in the background, its broken words painting a picture of horror. Entire star systems consumed, their light extinguished, their worlds left as empty husks. The Eclipse Core was not an enemy, it was an abyss, an unstoppable force that devoured all in its path. The crew waited in silence, their thoughts flowing into Kale's mind. They were afraid, but they were ready. The Nemesis had become something greater than they had ever imagined, something capable of facing the unknown. Kale turned to them, his voice steady, his presence unwavering. "Prepare the ship," he said, his words carrying the weight of destiny. Asterisk, this is not the end. This is the beginning. Asterisk. The Nemesis roared to life, its engines flaring with light as it prepared for hyperspace. The ship seemed to pulse with anticipation, its living hull shimmering like a star on the verge of collapse. The crew moved in unison, their thoughts aligned, their purpose clear. They were no longer just survivors, they were the storm, the force that would face the darkness. Kale stepped forward, his gaze fixed on the void. He could feel the Prime Echo within him, its presence vast and ancient, guiding him toward the unknown. The Eclipse Core was a threat unlike any they had faced, but Kale knew they could not turn away. Humanity had been forged in the fires of extinction, and now, they would rise to meet whatever lay ahead. The Nemesis jumped into hyperspace, its form stretching into light as it disappeared into the void. The stars around it seemed to shudder, their light dimming as the ship passed. And then, there was silence. The galaxy held its breath, waiting, watching, fearing. As the Nemesis vanished into the unknown, a single whisper lingered in the darkness. It was not a threat, nor a promise, but a simple truth. Asterisk, brace yourself. A human warship is coming. Asterisk,